Hey, look at this old timer. Does he even know what he's doing?
Probably not. Let's see how long this takes.
They laughed when they saw the 70-year-old wanting to work with engines. They called him useless, outdated, a nuisance. But when the factory's millionaire engine broke down and no one could fix it, the simple man did something that left everyone open-mouthed. Antonio adjusted the battered backpack on his shoulder and looked at the gigantic gate of the Brazilian metallurgical industry. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a mixture of anxiety and hope that he hadn't felt in a long time. After so many years away from what he loved to do most, he finally had a new chance. His gray hair was neatly combed, his beard neatly trimmed, and he wore his best shirt. In his calloused hands, he held a folder of documents that he had prepared the night before with great care. Today would be his first day as a maintenance assistant, but Antonio knew he had much more to offer than the position suggested. When he passed through the entrance, the security guard barely looked up. "Documents," he murmured without interest. Antonio handed over his new work card, still with the smell of freshly printed paper. It was strange to start a new profession at this stage of life, but he was determined to prove that he still had value. The corridor leading to the maintenance department was long and full of noisy machinery. Antonio observed everything carefully, recognizing equipment he knew like the back of his hand, engines that he had already disassembled and assembled hundreds of times at a time that seemed to be behind him forever. "You must be the new assistant," said a voice behind him. Antonio turned and saw a young engineer approaching, tablet in hand, expression of someone who had more important things to do. "I'm Bruno, the engineer responsible for the sector." "Antonio Silva. Nice to meet you," replied the old man, extending his hand politely. Bruno squeezed quickly, already looking elsewhere. "Look, I'm going to be direct with you. I don't know what criteria they use to hire someone of their experience, but here things work in a modern way. We have computerized systems, state-of-the-art technology. I hope you can keep up." The phrase hurt more than Antonio expected. He just felt her in silence, swallowing the pride that insisted on manifesting itself. He needed that job. He needed to prove to himself that he was still useful. Walking through the main shed, they passed a group of 3 young engineers gathered around a drawing board. When they saw Antonio, one of them whispered something to the others, who started laughing softly. "Guys," Bruno drew attention. "This is Antonio, our new cleaning and organization assistant." "Cleaning assistant?" Mateus, one of the engineers, feigned surprise. "I thought I was a senior consultant because of my age." The others laughed at the cruel joke. "Very funny," Bruno replied embarrassedly. "Antonio, these are Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo. They will explain how to keep the area organized." Leonardo, the youngest of the group, looked Antonio up and down. "Sir, are you sure you can handle the pace here? We work hard, it's not a place to rest." "Can I work?" Anthony answered simply, maintaining his dignity despite the growing humiliation. "That's good." Gabriel intruded with irony. "Because there is a lot of ground to sweep and a lot of tools to organize. I hope you don't have a problem with your back." The laughter was louder this time. Antonio felt his face heat up but remained silent. "I had faced worse situations in life, much worse." Bruno showed Antonio a closet with cleaning materials and a broom. "Its function is to keep everything clean and organized. Engineers can't afford to waste time looking for tools or stepping on dirt." "I understood," Antonio said, picking up the broom. It was humiliating, but he would do the job to the best of his ability. He always did everything perfectly. It was not going to be different now. As he began to sweep, he listened to the conversations of the young engineers. They talked about complex projects, imported engines, technologies that he knew better than any of them. But to them, he was just the old man of cleaning. "Be careful there, sir," Mateus said when Antonio passed near the bench where they worked. "These pieces cost more than your year's salary." Antonio looked at the parts and immediately recognized a diesel engine component that was incorrectly assembled. The installation was wrong. It would cause excessive vibration and premature wear. But who was he to say anything? "Sorry," he murmured, continuing with the cleanup. The day passed slowly. Antonio swept, organized tools, cleaned benches, always observing the work of the engineers. He saw small mistakes, procedures that could be optimized, simpler solutions to problems that they complicated, but he remained silent. At lunchtime, he sat alone in the cafeteria. The engineers occupied a table on the other side, laughing and talking loudly about their projects. Antonio ate his simple lunchbox, thinking about all the engines he had already repaired, all the innovations he had already created, all the experience that was being wasted there. When he returned from lunch, he found the factory in total panic. The main engine, responsible for all production in the sector, had stopped working. It was a gigantic imported machine that moved the entire assembly line. "This is a disaster." Bruno was screaming on the phone. The entire production stopped. "We need to solve this now." Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo were all around the engine, tablets and manuals scattered on the floor. His expressions of confidence had turned to pure despair. The constant noise of the factory had given way to a terrifying silence. "Have you tried to reconnect?" asked Gabriel in a cold sweat. "Of course you do," Leonardo replied irritado. "We tried everything in the manual. The problem is more serious." Antonio approached discreetly, pretending to arrange tools on a nearby bench. He looked at the engine and immediately identified telltale signs of the problem: the way the oil flowed, the specific smell in the air, the kind of noise he had made before he stopped. He knew those symptoms as he knew the lines of his own hand. "Call the technical assistance people," Bruno ordered nervously. "No matter how much it costs, every minute stopped is a loss of thousands." "I've already called," Matthew replied. "They said they can only come tomorrow morning." "You have to bring special pieces from Sao Paulo tomorrow," Bruno exploded. "You can't stop production until tomorrow. The director is going to fire us." Anthony continued to observe in silence. The problem was not in the parts, it was something much simpler. Something that could be solved in a few minutes by someone who really understood engines. But who would listen to an old cleaning assistant? "Have you tried to check the lubrication system?" Gabriel suggested desperately. "We have already checked everything," Leonardo countered. "It's working normal. And the electrical system is also normal." Antonio knew exactly where the problem was. He knew how to solve it. He knew that he did not need to wait for technical assistance nor to bring parts from Sao Paulo. But he also knew that if he offered help, he would only get more humiliation. "I'll have to call the director," Bruno said, defeated. "I'm going to have to explain that our team of engineers can't fix an engine." The young engineers looked at each other, panic on their faces. Their careers were on the line. Their reputation was being destroyed with each passing minute. Antonio finished organizing the tools and walked away, his heart heavy. He had in his hands the solution to their problem, but no one was interested in the opinion of an old man who came to sweep the floor. The sound of phones ringing echoed through the stalled factory. Worried employees crowded into groups whispering about layoffs and sector closures, and there he was, invisible to everyone, carrying decades of knowledge that could save that situation in minutes. Antonio put the broom in the closet and looked once more at the stopped engine. Tomorrow would be another day. Maybe tomorrow someone would be willing to listen to what an old cleaning assistant had to say. That night, Antonio arrived home with a heavy heart and a sore back. His small house on the outskirts of town was simple, but organized with the same whimsy he applied to everything in life. He sat in the worn armchair in the living room and stared at the dusty photograph on top of the old television. It was a photo of him as a young man, wearing mechanic's overalls, smiling next to a gigantic engine he had just repaired. At that time, he was known as the prodigy of My Industrial Química. Companies fought to have him on their teams. His reputation spanned entire states. "How everything has changed," he muttered to himself, carefully picking up the photo. He closed his eyes and let the memories come back. Decades ago, when he was still a young man full of dreams and energy, Antonio Silva was considered an engine genius. There was no machine he couldn't fix. There was no problem that resisted his knowledge. After a few years in the profession, he was already sought after by the largest businessmen in the country. He remembered the day he received his first major recognition. An automobile factory had imported a revolutionary production line from Germany, but the main engines had flaws that even European technicians could not solve. They called Anthony as their last hope. When he arrived at the factory, he found a team of German engineers completely lost. Machines that cost millions stopped for weeks. The company's director was desperate, seeing his investment turn into losses with each passing day. Antonio studied the engines for a few hours, analyzing every component, every system, every detail. While foreign technicians discussed complex theories and consulted huge manuals, he simply watched and listened. The engines spoke to him in a way that no one else could understand. The solution he found was so simple that it left everyone speechless. A small adjustment in calibration, a minimal modification in the power system. Within 2 hours, the entire production line was running smoothly. The Germans couldn't believe that a young Brazilian had solved it in hours, which they couldn't do in weeks. That was just the beginning. His fame spread rapidly through the industrial sector. Companies from all over the country began to seek him out to solve problems that seemed impossible. Antonio traveled constantly from factory to factory, saving entire productions with his extraordinary knowledge. He created innovations that revolutionized Brazilian industry, developed more efficient engine systems, saved millions in fuel for large companies, increased the productivity of dozens of factories. His name was respected and admired in all industrial circles of the country. He married Helena, a sweet teacher who understood his passion for motors and supported his dreams. They had a daughter, Isabella, who grew up hearing the noise of tools and the smell of diesel fuel as others listened to classical music. It was a happy, prosperous family, full of plans for the future. Antonio was at the peak of his career when the tragedy changed everything. Helena discovered a delicate condition that required constant care. The doctors were clear. She needed comprehensive attention, expensive treatments, permanent medical follow-up. There was no time for travels, for projects that required months away from home. Without hesitation, Antonio abandoned the career he loved so much. He turned down millionaire contracts, canceled important projects, said no to opportunities that others would kill to have. His family came first. Helena needed him, and he would be there. He sold the prosperous workshop he had built, sold expensive equipment, paid off investments, all to pay for Helena's treatments and support the family. He accepted simple employment, manual labor, anything that would allow him to stay close to home and take care of his wife. He became a truck driver, then a doorman, worked in warehouses, made deliveries. His reputation in the industry was gradually forgotten. People stopped looking for him. New technicians have occupied his space. His genius was erased by time and absence. Helena fought bravely, but after years of intensive treatments, she ended up leaving. Antonio was devastated, alone with teenage Isabella, with no money, no prospects. The daughter got a scholarship and moved to another city to study medicine. He wanted to help people as his mother had been helped. He was alone in an empty house, working jobs that did not challenge even a tenth of his ability. Years passed slowly, monotonously, lacklusterly. The man who was once considered a mechanical genius now packed products in a supermarket, carried boxes in a warehouse, did jobs that anyone could do, but inside his love for engines never died. In his spare time, he repaired neighbors' cars.
He helped local mechanics with complex problems.
He kept alive the knowledge he had accumulated in a lifetime dedicated to the profession. It was like a virtuoso musician playing to empty audiences. Isabella graduated as a doctor and got a job in another state. She called every week worried about her father, but he always said he was fine. She didn't want to be a burden in her daughter's life who had so much potential ahead of her. She deserved to fly high without worrying about a father who had chosen a simple life. But recently, something inside Antonio began to awaken again. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the feeling that he was wasting his last productive years. He began to miss the smell of motor oil, the noise of perfectly working gears, the satisfaction of solving problems that seemed impossible. That was when he saw the advertisement of the Brazilian metallurgical industries looking for maintenance assistants. It wasn't the position he deserved. It didn't reflect his true ability, but it was an opportunity to get back closer to what he loved most. He decided to apply, purposely omitting his actual experience on his resume. He knew that if he told the whole truth, they would either not believe him or they would create expectations that could scare him. I had been away from the profession for so long that I was afraid of having lost the ability. He preferred to start slowly, to prove his worth gradually, to regain the confidence he had lost over the years. On the first day of work, when the young engineers mocked him, Antonio felt a mixture of pain and irony. Here were boys who probably didn't even dream when he was revolutionizing Brazilian industry. They were treating as useless the man who had already solved problems that they couldn't even imagine, but didn't hold a grudge. He understood that to them he was just an old man trying to work in an area for which he seemed to have no qualifications. How could they know that those calloused hands had already created innovations that changed entire factories? When he saw the main engine broken and all production stopped, He felt his heart racing for the first time in years. He immediately recognized the kind of failure. He knew exactly where the problem was. I knew the solution as if it were a cake recipe. It was a problem he had faced dozens of times throughout his career, but he also knew that no one would listen to a cleaning assistant. He needed to find a way to help without sounding presumptuous, without creating embarrassment for the young engineers who were clearly panicking. He got up from his chair and went to an old trunk in the room. Inside, carefully guarded, were his special tools, keys he had used in historic projects, precision instruments he knew as extensions of his own hands. He hadn't touched them for years, but they were impeccably preserved. He took an old wrench worn out by use, which had been a companion in hundreds of concerts. He felt the familiar weight in his hand, the familiar texture of metal. It was like meeting a dear friend again after a long separation. "Tomorrow," he said to the photograph at the table. "Tomorrow I'm going to show what I'm still capable of." I knew it would be risky. If he tried to help and failed, it would be definitive humiliation. But if he could solve the problem that had the entire engineering team in despair, perhaps he would regain some of the respect he had lost over the years. Isabella called that night as she did every week. "How was the first day at the new job, Dad?" "It was interesting, daughter. Very interesting. Are you enjoying it?" Antonio looked at the tools scattered on the bed, at the photo of him as a young man next to the repaired engine, at the whole story of a life dedicated to mechanics. "I'm coming home," she said with a smile she couldn't see on the phone. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I'm going back to the place where I've always belonged." The second day at the factory started with a completely different atmosphere. Antonio arrived early, but the environment he found was full of tension and despair. Employees whispered in groups, worried faces, anxious glances directed at the gigantic engine that continued to pass love as a dead iron monster. Bruno had been on the phone since early on, his voice increasingly changing with each call. "How so? Only next week? No, you do not understand the gravity of the situation. The entire production is stopped." Antonio took his broom and got to work, but kept his ears open to each conversation. Matthew was sitting on a bench, holding his head in his hands, completely defeated. Gabriel walked from one side to the other nervously, while Leonardo leafed through technical manuals with increasing desperation. "My career is over," Mateus muttered to his colleagues. "If we don't solve this soon, we will all be fired." "Calm down," Gabriel tried to reassure, but his own voice trembled. "There is still technical assistance coming today. Technical assistance that costs a fortune and does not guarantee that it will solve it." Leonardo countered bitterly. "What if they can't either?" Antonio continued sweeping, but every word hurt in his chest. I knew exactly what kind of problem that engine was facing. It was something she could solve with her eyes closed. But here she was invisible, while talented young people saw their careers threatened by something so simple. Around mid-morning, 2 luxury cars parked in front of the factory. 4 impeccably dressed men got out, carrying suitcases of expensive equipment and state-of-the-art tablets. It was the team of outside consultants that the company had hired in desperation. The experts arrived. Bruno announced, relieved, running to greet them at the entrance. The leader of the team was Rodrigo Mendez, a renowned consultant who charged astronomical amounts per hour of work. Perfectly combed hair, designer glasses, all the posture of someone who was used to being treated as a savior in impossible situations. "Mr. Bruno, let's resolve this quickly," Rodrigo said with excessive confidence. "Our team has already solved similar cases in multinationals. This engine will not be a problem, thank God." Bruno sighed in relief. "You are our last hope." The team of consultants approached the engine with all the pomp and circumstance. They scattered electronic equipment around the machine, connected cables and sensors. They turned on laptops that began to do complex analyses. All very impressive, very technological, very expensive. Anthony watched from afar, pretending to arrange tools on a nearby bench. He saw the consultants doing elaborate procedures, sophisticated tests, analyses that took hours to show obvious results. They were looking in the wrong place, using complicated methods for a simple problem. "The electronic system is working perfectly," announced Claudio, one of the consultants, after 2 hours of work. "And the hydraulic part?" asked Rodrigo. "Also normal," replied Marcelo, another member of the team. "Optimum pressure flow parameters. So the problem must be in the combustion system," concluded Rodrigo, sounding knowledgeable. Let's do a complete analysis of the injectors. Antonio shook his head discreetly. They were wasting time with systems that worked perfectly, ignoring the real problem that was glaring to anyone with real experience. But who was he to interfere in a consultancy that cost thousands per hour? The hours passed slowly. The team of consultants disassembled parts that didn't need to be disassembled, tested components that were functioning normally, created complicated diagnostics for a problem that required simple solution. Bruno followed everything nervously, seeing the value of the consultancy rise every minute without concrete results. We found some minor irregularities. Rodrigo announced it in the late afternoon, trying to justify the day's work. We're going to need to bring in more specific equipment tomorrow. Tomorrow? Bruno exploded. Can't you solve it today? Unfortunately not. The problem is more complex than we imagined. We will need more time and resources. But resources mean more costs.
Obviously, quality has a price.
Bruno was desperate. For each day of production stopped, the company lost a fortune. With each passing hour, his position in the company became more threatened. And now the expert consultants were saying they needed even more time and money. Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo were at rock bottom. They had bet all their chips on the team of consultants and now discovered that not even the most expensive specialists had an immediate solution. Their careers were really in jeopardy. This is a nightmare, Gabriel muttered in defeat. Not even the best consultants in the country can solve it. Maybe the engine is really badly malfunctioning, Leonardo said hopelessly. It may need to be replaced completely. Replacing it would cost millions. Matthew completed gloomily. The company will never accept this. They will prefer to fire everyone. Anthony continued to work in silence, arranging tools with automatic movements while his mind buzzed. He saw young talents being torn apart by a problem he could solve in minutes. I saw an entire company suffering huge losses for something so simple that it hurt to watch. At the end of the day, the consultants left, promising to return the next day with even more sophisticated equipment. Bruno stayed in the office, making desperate calls to the board, trying to explain why the situation had not yet been resolved. The young engineers gathered at a table in the cafeteria, defeated, talking in a whisper about the consequences of failure. Some production workers walked past them, casting disapproving looks, knowing that their jobs were also at risk. Antonio finished cleaning and was putting away the materials when she heard a conversation that changed everything. Two veteran workers were chatting near the stopped engine. "You know what makes me angry?" said Joaquim, an employee with decades of experience. "They spend fortunes on outside consultants and don't ask anything to those who have worked here for years." "It's true," agreed Sebastião, another veteran. "We know this machine like no one else. We've seen it work in all situations. I remember when we had a similar problem a few years ago. The old coach who worked here solved it quickly. It was something simple, but the engineers couldn't figure it out either." "What coach was this?" "I don't remember the name. An experienced gentleman who understood engines like no one else. Too bad he retired." Anthony approached the two men slowly, his heart racing. It was now or never. He had to make a decision that could change everything or destroy his dignity once and for all. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Can I ask a question?" The two workers turned around, surprised. "Of course, Senor Antonio. Do you think the problem with this engine is really that complicated?" Joaquim laughed bitterly. "Complex for those who really understand motors. I bet it's a simple thing, but who's going to listen to us? What if someone who really understands engines looked at him?" Anthony asked carefully. "It would be great," Sebastião replied. "But where to find someone like that? The consultants are famous, but it seems that they never really got their hands dirty." Antonio took a deep breath. It was time to take the first step out of the shadows. "Can I take a look at the engine?" The two workers looked at each other, surprised. "Do you understand mechanics?" "I understand a little." "A little?" Joaquim asked curiously. "Have you worked with engines before?" Antonio hesitated. Telling the whole truth would be too risky, but I could no longer stand still watching that situation. "Yes, I have worked for a long time." "So look there." Sebastian pointed to the gigantic engine. "If you can find out what these expensive consultants couldn't, you'll be a hero of the factory." Antonio approached the stopped engine with careful steps. It had been weeks since I had been so close to a machine of this size, but it was like meeting an old love again. His senses immediately awakened, recognizing every sound, every smell, every revealing detail. He ran his hands over the surface of the engine, feeling the residual vibrations, observing oil marks, analyzing signals that only decades of experience could interpret. In a few minutes, he was absolutely sure of the diagnosis. "Did you find anything?" Joaquim asked anxiously. Antonio turned around with a discreet smile. "Found. Serious? What is it?" "It's pretty simple, actually, but I'm going to need some specific tools. Can you fix it?" Antonio looked at the engine one last time, then at the two workers who were watching him with a growing hope. "I can, but you have a problem." "Which?" "No one will believe that a cleaning assistant can solve what famous consultants couldn't." Sebastian laughed. "Leave that to us. If you really manage to fix it, we make everyone believe." It was the opportunity Antonio had been waiting for, the chance to prove that he still had value, that his experience had not been lost over time, but it was also a huge risk. If it failed, it would be the ultimate humiliation. "Okay," he finally said. "Tomorrow morning before the consultants arrive, I'll show you how to solve this." The two workers looked at each other with emotion. Finally, someone who seemed to have real confidence. "No, just complicated theories. Let's warn the people," Joaquim said excitedly. Everyone will want to see that when Antonio left the factory that night, he felt a mixture of nervousness and emotion that he hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow would be the day that would change everything. Either he would prove that he was still the genius he once was, or he would discover that time had taken away his ability forever. But deep in my heart, when she closed her eyes and remembered the feeling of touching that engine, she knew exactly what was going to happen. Some talents never get lost, they just stay asleep, waiting for the right opportunity to awaken. Dawn came slowly for Antonio, who could barely sleep thinking about what he was about to do. He got up before sunrise, took a careful shower, put on his best work clothes, and sorted out some special tools he had stored in his trunk. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. He arrived at the factory an hour before the workday started. Joaquim and Sebastian were already there waiting, accompanied by other veteran workers who had been warned about what was going to happen. The buzz was contained, but anticipation was in the air like electricity before the storm. Senor Antonio, Joaquim approached excitedly. "I brought the tools you asked for." "Perfect," Antonio replied, examining the instruments. "Now I need to take a closer look at the engine before everyone arrives." He approached the gigantic machine with reverence, as if approaching a sacred altar. His experienced hands began to go through every component, every connection, every detail that told a story to those who knew how to interpret. The silence around him was absolute, everyone watching this simple man work with a confidence that was in stark contrast to his position in the company. In 15 minutes, Antonio had definitive confirmation of what he already suspected. The problem was exactly where he imagined, a place that the consultants had not even examined properly. It was a simple failure, but it required practical knowledge to be identified, discreetly, feeling the family satisfaction of a correct diagnosis. "Did you find it?" "Y Sebastian?" he asked anxiously. "Did I find it?" "That's exactly what I thought. Can you fix it?" "I can, but it will be confusing when people arrive." At that moment, the main lights of the factory came on and the first employees began to arrive for work. Bruno rushed in, already on the phone, arguing with someone about the rising costs of consulting. The young engineers arrived with their heads down, knowing that they would face another day of failure and humiliation. "Good morning, Mr. Bruno." Joaquim approached the manager with determination. "We need to talk to you about the engine." "Talk what?" Bruno replied angrily. "The consultants will arrive soon to continue the work." "That's what we want to talk about. We have someone here who can solve the problem." Bruno stopped walking and looked at Joaquim as if he had gone crazy. "Anyone here? Who?" "Send for Antonio." Bruno searched with his eyes until he found Antonio standing near the engine, tools in hand, confident posture that did not match the cleaning assistant he knew. "Are you kidding me?" "I'm not." He analyzed the engine and said he knows what the problem is. "Joaquim, I don't have time for jokes. We have a serious situation here. That's exactly what I'm talking about. If he can solve it, we save time and money." Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo approached curiously, listening to the conversation that seemed absurd. The cleaning assistant they had humiliated was now being presented as a possible solution to the problem that even expert consultants could not solve. "That's ridiculous," Matthew muttered to Gabriel. "The old man can barely read, let alone fix such an engine." Let him try, Gabriel replied skeptically. When it fails, at least we'll have a good story to tell. Bruno approached Antonio, visibly embarrassed by the situation. Mr. Antonio, is Joaquim saying that you understand engines? I understand a little, Antonio replied modestly. A little? Do you think you can solve what a team of expert consultants couldn't? Can I give it a try to try? Bruno exploded. Senator Antonio, with all due respect, this is no joke. This engine is worth millions. The entire production depends on him. It is no place for experiments. I understand his concern, Antonio said calmly. But what do you have to lose? The consultants have already failed twice. They will spend another day and more money without any guarantee. And do you guarantee that you can fix it? I guarantee that I know what the problem is and I know how to solve it. Leonardo intruded into the conversation with barely concealed irony. Senrel, Antonio, you work as a cleaner. How can you know more than engineer the graduates? I don't know more than you, Antonio replied humbly. I only have hands-on experience with this type of engine. What experience? Matthias challenged. Where did you work before? Antonio hesitated. Telling the full truth was still too risky. I worked in workshops, some factories. I've seen this kind of problem before, in backyard workshops. Gabriel laughed. Sir, this is state-of-the-art technology, not a beetle, old man. The provocation hurt, but Antonio kept calm. He knew he needed to prove it with actions, not words. If you allow me, I can show you what the problem is in 5 minutes. Minutes, Bruno repeated incredulously. The consultant spent 2 days analyzing. Sometimes practical experience teaches shortcuts that theory does not show. At that moment, the consultant's cars parked in front of the factory. Rodrigo and his team went down, carrying even more equipment, ready for another day of expensive and ineffective analysis. Ready, Bruno sighed in relief. The real professionals arrived. Senor Antonio, I thank you for your intention, but let's leave that to those who understand. Wait. Joaquim interceded. Why don't we place a bet? What bet? Bruno asked suspiciously. If Mr. Anthony can identify and solve the problem before the consultants, you recognize that you judged him wrong. And if he doesn't succeed, then he assumes that he said more than he knew and apologizes. Bruno looked at Antonio, then at the young engineers, then at the workers who surrounded him with expectation. The situation was getting embarrassing, but maybe it was a way to end that absurd discussion once and for all. Okay, he said finally, but on one condition. If you fail, in addition to apologizing, you will be transferred to another sector. Away from the equipment, Antonio felt the weight of the bet. It was all or nothing. Success would mean recognition and respect. Failure would mean definitive humiliation and loss of the work he had so hard achieved. I accept, he said in a firm voice. Accepts, Matthew asked, surprised. Sir, are you sure of what you are doing? Have. Rodrigo and his team entered the factory at this point, finding a crowd gathered around the stopped engine. The consultant did not like the situation at all. What's going on here? Asked the author. We have an interesting situation, Bruno explained, embarrassed. An employee of ours says he can solve the engine problem. Rodrigo looked Antonio up and down, saw a simple man with basic tools, and let out a mocking laugh. This gentleman, really? Too serious? Joaquim answered defiantly. Look, Rodrigo said with dismissal. I respect the experience of older mechanics, but this engine has technology that requires specific knowledge. Not just anyone can mess with it. So let's see. Sebastian stumbled. If you are such an expert, why couldn't you solve it in 2 days? The question caught Rodrigo off guard. His arrogance faltered for a second before regaining his composure. Engines like this require meticulous analysis. It is not fixed at the base of the kick. No one talked about a kick, Antonio said calmly. I spoke of experience. What experience do you have with industrial engines? Antonio looked around, saw all eyes fixed on him, felt the weight of the expectation of dozens of people. It was time to start showing who he really was. More than he imagines, he answered with a confidence that made Rodrigo frown. Then prove it, the consultant challenged. If you are that experienced, show what the problem is. Can I look at the engine? Clear. But when you fail, I want you to admit that you were bluffing. Antonio approached the engine under tense eyes from the entire factory. Employees stopped their activities to watch. Garras came down from their offices until the director of the company appeared to see what was causing such a stir. He put his hands on the engine and closed his eyes for a few seconds, feeling the vibrations, listening to the noises inside, connecting with the machine in a way that only decades of experience allowed. Then he opened his eyes and started working. His hands moved with surgical precision, removing caps, checking for connections, following a logic that seemed invisible to everyone else. In 3 minutes, he located exactly what he was looking for. Here, he said, pointing to a specific component. The problem is here. Rodrigo approached skeptical. There, impossible. We have already verified this part. They checked superficially. The problem is not in the component itself, it is in the way it was calibrated. Calibration? But the parameters are all within specifications. They are within standard specifications, Antonio explained patiently. But this specific engine has a particularity that requires different calibration. What particularity? Antonio showed a small mark on the engine chassis, almost imperceptible, which indicated a specific version of the machine. This is a modified model for tropical conditions. The calibration has to take into account the local humidity and temperature. Rodrigo looked at the brand, consulted his manuals, and his expression changed completely. Antonio was right. It was a detail they had completely ignored. How did you know that? He asked in amazement. Experience? Antonio replied simply, I've worked with this specific model before. The crowd around held their breath. The famous consultant was being outclassed by a cleaning assistant. The situation was surreal. Can you do the recalibration? I, Bruno? He asked anxiously. I can, but I'm going to need some specific tools. What tools? Antonio opened his suitcase, the old tools, and removed instruments that made Rodrigo widen his eyes. They were not ordinary tools. They were precision instruments, some clearly modified by hand, others that seemed to have been custom-made. Where did you get these tools? Rodrigo asked, impressed. Some I bought, others I made myself over the years. Did you do it? These tools must cost a fortune. For those who know how to use them, they are priceless. Antonio began the recalibration work. Every move was precise, confident, the fruit of decades of practical experience. It adjusted parameters that not even the consultants knew existed, made minimal modifications that required in-depth knowledge of the machine. In 20 minutes, he finished the job. Ready, he said simply. Ready? Gabriel asked incredulously. Is that all? Is that it? Now we just have to start the engine. No, Bruno approached the control panel with his hands shaking. If Antonio was right, his career was saved. If he was wrong, he would have to fire an employee for incompetence and still deal with a broken engine. Press the launch button. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the engine began to rumble gently, gradually gaining strength until it reached perfect operation. The silence that fell over the factory was deafening. Then it exploded in celebratory shouts, clapping, hugs. The engine was running. Production could come back. Antonio had succeeded. Rodrigo looked at the engine running with the expression of someone who couldn't believe what he saw. Unbelievable, he murmured. 20 minutes to solve what we couldn't do in 2 days. Bruno approached Antonio with tears in his eyes. Senor. Antonio, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my job, you saved the factory. You don't need to thank them. I just did my job. Your job, sir? Who are you, really? Anthony looked around, saw all eyes fixed on him, saw respect where there had been disdain before. He saw admiration where there had been mockery before. It was time to start revealing the truth. I'm just someone who loves engines, he said with a mysterious smile, and who still has a lot to teach. The factory exploded in applause again. Anthony had won the first battle, but he knew that the war was just beginning. Soon everyone would find out who he really was, and then everything would change forever. The news that the engine had been repaired by a cleaning assistant spread through the factory like fire in dry straw. Officials abandoned their posts to see for themselves the man who had done the impossible. Managers came down from their offices. Workmen crowded around the engine running perfectly, and whispers of incredulity echoed from every corner. Antonio remained calm in the center of the hurricane, organizing his tools with the same meticulousness as always. But now the gazes directed at him were completely different. Where there had been contempt before, there was now curiosity. Where once there was ridicule, now a cautious respect grew. Rodrigo was visibly distraught, examining the engine, running as if it were a supernatural apparition. His team of consultants looked at each other embarrassedly, trying to process the fact that they had been outclassed by someone who didn't even seem to have gone to college. That's impossible, Claudio murmured to Marcelo. How did he know exactly where the problem was? And those tools he used? Marcelo replied in admiration. I have never seen instruments of that type. They seem tailor-made for this particular job. Bruno approached Antonio with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity that he could no longer hide. Senor Antonio, I must admit that I was completely wrong about you. Don't worry, Antonio replied kindly. Appearances can be deceiving. But now I'm curious. How did you learn so much about engines? Where did you work before? Antonio hesitated. He knew the moment of truth was approaching, but he wasn't ready to reveal everything yet. I have worked in several companies throughout my life. I learned a lot from each experience. Which companies? Some you probably don't know were a long time ago. Matthew approached them, clearly bothered by the situation. He had spent years studying engineering, prided himself on his theoretical knowledge, and now saw a man without a college degree solve in minutes what he couldn't do in days. Senor Antonio, he said, trying to keep his composure. I admit that you surprised us, but it's one thing to fix a specific problem. It's another to really understand how the engine works. What do you mean by that? Joaquim asked defensively. I mean, maybe it was luck. Perhaps he had seen this exact problem before and knew the memorized solution. The provocation was clear, but Antonio did not change. You're right, he said calmly. An isolated solution does not prove comprehensive knowledge. Gabriel joined the conversation, seeing an opportunity to regain some lost prestige. That's right, any experienced mechanic can have some solutions memorized. Then challenge me, Anthony said simply. The phrase fell like lightning in the middle of the conversation. Everyone turned to him in surprise. What do you mean? Leonardo asked. Ask me questions about engines, test my knowledge. If you really think it was luck, prove it. Rodrigo approached interested. His arrogance had been wounded, but his professional curiosity was aroused. Are you proposing a technical test? Any questions about industrial engines, combustion systems, calibration, preventive maintenance, you name it? Bruno looked around, seeing the growing crowd of fun who had stopped to watch. The situation was turning into a public spectacle. Senor Antonio, this is not necessary. For me it is, Antonio replied with determination. I want you to know that it wasn't luck, Sebastian shouted from the crowd. Accept it, guys. Let's see who understands more about motoring. The provocation worked. Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo looked at each other and accepted the challenge. Rodrigo also joined, seeing a chance to regain his lost reputation. Very well, Gabriel, he said confidently. First question. What is the difference between stoichiometric combustion and lean combustion in diesel engines? Antonio smiled discreetly. It was a complex technical question that required in-depth knowledge of combustion engineering. Stoichiometric combustion uses the optimal ratio of air to fuel for complete burning. Lean combustion uses excess air, reducing emissions but can cause a loss of power if poorly calibrated. Correct, Gabriel, he admitted, surprised. But anyone can have memorized that. So ask something more specific, Antonio challenged. Leonardo took control. How to calculate the nominal torque of an engine based on displacement and average effective pressure. Torque equal to average effective pressure, multiplied by displacement divided by 4 pi for 4-stroke engines divided by 2 pi for 2-stroke engines. Antonio answered instantly. The answer was correct and had been given without hesitation. Leonardo broke out in a cold sweat. Matthew tried an even more complex question. What is the effect of altitude on the power of naturally aspirated engines, and how to compensate for this loss? For every 1,000 menors of altitude, naturally aspirated engines lose approximately 10% of their power due to the reduction in air density. Compensation can be made through injection recalibration, turbochargers, or modification of the compression ratio. Rodrigo was impressed. The answers were not only correct, they were accurate and demonstrated a deep understanding of the concepts. Sir, may I ask a more practical question? Of course, we have an engine that shows excessive vibration only at specific revs. How to diagnose and solve? Antonio closed his eyes for a few seconds as if he were visualizing the problem. Vibration at specific rotations indicates resonance. First, it checks the balance of the crankshaft, then alignment of the cylinders, irregular tension in the fixing bolts, and possible harmonic in the transmission system. Solution varies depending on the identified cause. Specific, Rodrigo murmured in admiration. Very specific. The crowd around was mesmerized. Employees who had never paid attention to technical discussions now hung over every word, seeing an intellectual duel that was clearly leaning toward the cleaner's side. My turn, Anthony said softly. Can I ask you questions? The young engineers looked at each other nervously. They didn't expect the tables to turn. Simple question, Antonio continued. Why do diesel engines have higher thermal efficiency than gasoline engines? Gabriel responded quickly. Higher compression ratio. Correct, but incomplete. Can anyone complement it? Embarrassed silence. Higher compression ratio is part of the answer, Antonio patiently explained. But we also have self-ignition combustion that allows better control of burning. Less heat loss through the cylinder walls due to the more efficient cycle and diesel properties that allow more complete extraction of energy. Rodrigo nodded in impressment. You don't just know the answers, you understand behind them. Next question. Antonio continued. How to determine the optimal injection point in a diesel engine without using electronic equipment? This time no one dared to answer. A classic method, Antonio explained, is to use auditory analysis of combustion, observation of the color of the exhaust gases, manual measurement of the temperature at different points of the engine, and response test at different loads. It requires hands-on experience which only comes with years of actual work. The difference was becoming clear to everyone. The engineers had solid theoretical knowledge, but Anthony demonstrated a practical understanding that only decades of real experience could provide. One last question, said Antonio, looking directly at the young people. What is the most common mistake that newly graduated engineers make when diagnosing engine problems? Matthew tried to answer. Lack of practical experience. More specifically, the mistake is relying too much on equipment and theory, forgetting to use one's senses. Motor speaks to those who know how to listen. Vibration, noise, smell, temperature, leak color. All this tells a story, but only those who really worked with their hands know how to interpret it. The lesson hurt, but it was given with kindness. Antonio was not humiliating anyone he was teaching. Mr. Antonio Bruno intervened with emotion. You are not only an experienced mechanic, you are a master. I'm just someone who has dedicated his life to understanding engines. Antonio replied modestly. Where did you learn so much? Rodrigo asked with genuine respect. Anthony looked around, saw hundreds of eyes fixed on him, felt that the time had come to start revealing the truth. I learned by working, he said slowly. Working in places where there were no manuals or computers, where the engine either worked or production stopped, where mistakes were too costly to be made. What were these places? Places where a young mechanic learned that theoretical knowledge without practical experience is like having tools, without knowing how to use them. The answer was enigmatic, but loaded with meaning. Everyone realized that there was much more in Antonio's story than he was revealing. Senor Antonio. Matthew approached humbly. Can I apologize? I judged you by your appearance and I was completely wrong. Yes, Antonio replied kindly, but you don't have to be ashamed. Everyone makes this mistake at some point in their life. Gabriel and Leonardo also approached to apologize. Rodrigo shook her hand with genuine respect. The transformation was complete, from despised to respected in just a few hours. But Antonio knew that this was just the beginning. Soon everyone would find out who he really was, and then the real revolution would begin. The atmosphere in the factory had completely changed. Employees who had previously barely greeted Antonio now approached with genuine respect, wanting to exchange a few words with the man who had become a legend in a matter of hours. The engine ran perfectly. Production had resumed its normal pace, and everyone knew that this was only possible thanks to the extraordinary knowledge of someone they judged by their appearance. Bruno was on the phone with the board, recounting the day's events with an excitement he couldn't disguise. Yes, Mr. Director, the engine is running perfectly. No, sir, it wasn't the consultants. It was an employee of ours from the maintenance sector. Antonio kept his special tools in his briefcase with the same care as always. But now every move was watched with fascination by the young engineers. Matthew approached hesitantly, clearly curious about these unique instruments. Mr. Antonio, may I ask about your tools? I've never seen any of those. Antonio smiled discreetly. It was time to explain at least part of the story. Some I've done over the years. When you work with specific engines, you sometimes need instruments that don't exist on the market. Did you manufacture it yourself? Yes. This key here said showing an instrument that looked ordinary, but had subtle modifications. I adapted it to work with German engines from the 80s. The original calibration did not suit our conditions. Gabriel joined the conversation, impressed. This requires knowledge of metallurgy as well. When you love what you do, you learn everything you need to do it well. Leonardo observed a particularly interesting tool with marks of use that told decades of work. This one must have a story. Antonio picked up the instrument delicately, as if playing a sacred relic. This tool has been with me for over 40 years. I used it in the first important engine that I repaired myself. 40 years? Mateus repeated, impressed. Have you been working with engines for that long? There is even more time. I started very young. Rodrigo approached the group, his previous arrogance completely replaced by professional curiosity. Onel. Senor Antonio, can I ask you a question that is intriguing me? Of course, you knew exactly the problem with that engine. It wasn't a diagnosis, it was recognition. How is this possible? The question was insightful, and Anthony knew he could no longer avoid revealing at least part of the truth, because I had worked with this particular model before, several times. Where does this company use this type of engine? Antonio hesitated. The time of the reveal was coming faster than he expected. I have worked in many companies throughout my career. Some you know, others you may not. Bruno ended the call and approached the group, visibly moved. Senor. Antonio, I just spoke with the general director. He wants to meet you in person. It is not necessary. Yes, it is. You saved millions in losses. You saved jobs. You saved the company's reputation. It's the least we can do. At that moment, an elegant middle-aged man entered the shed accompanied by 2 assistants. It was Henrique Carvalho, the company's general director, a person used to dealing only with important executives and suppliers. His presence on the factory floor was a rare event that made all employees straighten up. Where is the man who solved our problem? He asked, looking around. Bruno pointed to Antonio. Mr. Director, this is Antonio Silva. Henrique approached with decisive steps, studying that simple employee who had made such an impact. Senor Antonio, it's a pleasure to meet you. Bruno told me about his extraordinary feat. I just did my job, Mr. Director. His work, Henrique Riu. Sir, what you have done today is far beyond any job description. I want to know more about your experience. I have been working with engines for many years. In which companies? The direct question left Antonio at a crossroads. Continuing to lie would be disrespectful to people who had given her a second chance, but revealing the full truth still seemed risky. I have worked in various automobile and metallurgical industries, he said carefully. Engine development, technical, consulting, complex problem-solving, technical consulting. Rodrigo intruded surprised. Did you work as a consultant? Yes, I worked. For which companies? Antonio took a deep breath. There was no way to avoid it. For companies such as Volkswagen, Ford, Mercedes-Benz, some national and multinational metallurgical companies. The silence that fell on the group was absolute. Henrique stopped smiling. Rodrigo widened his eyes. The young engineers looked at each other incredulously. Mercedes-Benz? Henrique repeated slowly. Did you work for Mercedes-Benz? I worked on projects to optimize diesel engines for tropical conditions. When? A few years ago, before I left the area, Gabriel was processing information with difficulty. Senor Antonio, are you saying that you have been a consultant for multinationals? Was. So why is working as a cleaning assistant? But Antonio's question he knew deserved an honest answer. Life sometimes forces us to make choices. I had to step away from the profession for personal reasons. When I decided to go back, I found that the market is not kind to people my age. Henry was visibly shaken. Senor Antonio, are you saying that we have a former consultant for multinationals working as an assistant in our company? It's saying that we lose years of knowledge and experience because we judge by appearance, Bruno muttered in horror. Matthew approached, now completely humble. Senor Antonio, when you said you had experience, you were being too modest. I prefer to demonstrate knowledge through actions, not through bonds. Rodrigo shook his head, still processing the revelation. Now I understand the specialized tools, the specific knowledge, the way he diagnosed the problem. You are not only an experienced mechanic, you are a very high-level specialist. It was Antonio, corrected. Now I'm just an employee trying to start over. No, Henry said firmly. As of today, you are no longer an assistant to anything. I want to offer you a position compatible with your experience. Mr. Director, thank you, but don't come here looking for promotions. So why did it come? Anthony looked around, saw all eyes fixed on him, waiting for an answer that would explain that unbelievable story. I came because I missed the engines. I missed the noise of the machines running, the smell of oil, the satisfaction of solving problems. I accepted any position just to get back to being close to what I always loved. The sincerity of the answer touched everyone. Henrique came closer, clearly moved. Senor Antonio, how many important projects have you developed throughout your career? Some. How many is some? Anthony hesitated, but he knew he could no longer minimize his experience. I developed engine systems that are still used in various industries. I created modifications that saved millions in fuel for large companies. I trained engineers who today occupy important positions in the sector. Matthew was pale. Sir, we mock someone who probably taught our professors in college. Don't torture yourself for it. You couldn't know. But we could have respected it. Gabriel said in a choked voice. We could have given it a chance before judging. Leonardo approached with tears in his eyes. Senor. Antonio. Can I ask for something? Of course, can it teach us? Can it show us what it really means to understand engines? The question moved Antonio deeply. Do you really want to learn? Want. The three answered in leather. So I teach, but you will have to sweat, get dirty, work with your hands for real. Theoretical knowledge without practice is like having an engine without fuel. Henrique intervened enthusiastically. Senor. Antonio, I want to make an official proposal. I would like you to take on the position of senior technical consultant for the company. Salary commensurate with their experience, full autonomy to implement improvements, and authority to train our team. Mr. Director, it is not a favor, it is a necessity. We discovered today that we have a hidden treasure in our company. It would be irresponsible of me not to take advantage of it properly. Rodrigo approached humbly. Senor. Antonio, can I apologize? On behalf of the entire category of consultants, you have given us a lesson in humility that we will never forget. You don't need to apologize, you need to learn from experience. Bruno was too emotional to speak properly. Senor Antonio, you transformed our company in one day. It has transformed our way of thinking, our way of working. It has transformed our way of seeing people. Joaquim shouted from the crowd, drawing applause from all the employees. Sebastian joined. You taught us that experience has no age. The factory erupted in applause. Employees from all sectors approached to greet Antonio to thank him for the life lesson they had witnessed. It was a moment of recognition that he hadn't experienced in decades. Henry raised his voice to be heard by all. Employees, I want everyone to know that Senor Antonio Silva is officially our new SIOR technical consultant. He will lead improvements in all our processes and train our teams. The applause was deafening. Anthony looked around, saw smiling faces where there had been contempt before. He saw admiration where there had been mockery before. But most importantly, he saw that he had regained something he thought he had lost forever: professional respect. One last thing, said Henry. Senor Antonio, I would like to know your story better. I'm sure there's a lot more to learn. Antonio smiled, knowing that there were still secrets to reveal. So, Mr. Director, there is much more to tell. And, as he received greetings and hugs from people he had conquered, not with words but with competence, Antonio knew that his journey back to the top was just beginning. Months have passed since that day that changed everything in the Brazilian metallurgical industry. The factory had been completely transformed under the leadership of Antonio Silva, now respectfully called Master Anthony by all employees. What began as a story of humiliation had become the greatest lesson of transformation that this company had ever witnessed. The office that Henrique had offered to Antonio remained empty for most of the day. He preferred to stay on the factory floor, teaching young engineers with oil-smeared hands. showing in practice what decades of theory can't always convey. His makeshift desk on a bench next to the engines had become a pilgrimage point for employees from all sectors. Matthew, Gabriel, and Leonardo were now his most devoted disciples. Youthful arrogance had given way to a genuine thirst for learning that impressed even company veterans. They arrived early, left late, and absorbed the master's every word like thirsty sponges. Mestre Antonio Mateos approached that morning carrying a detailed report. "We have finished the analysis you asked for on optimization of the engines of Sector 3. "Show me," Antonio said, wiping his hands on the cloth before picking up the papers. He read each line carefully, making notes in the margins, his experience filtering theory through actual practice. "It's good," he concluded after a few minutes, "but you forgot to consider the temperature variation during the summer. These engines will work 15 degrees warmer in January." Gabriel hit his forehead. "It's true. How can we not think about it?" "Because they are still learning to think like engines think," Antonio smiled. "Machine does not read manual. It responds to the real environment, not the ideal." Leonardo wrote down each word in a notebook that had become his personal Bible. "Master, how you can always see these details that escape us. 50 years talking to motors, young man. After so long, they start talking to you." The transformation of those boys was impressive. From arrogant engineers, they had become humble and competent professionals, respected by workers and admired by the board. Antonio felt paternal pride seeing how they grew professionally and personally. Joaquim approached excitedly, interrupting the improvised class. "Mestre Antonio, a visit has come to you." A very elegant lady said that she is her daughter. Antonio stopped talking and looked at the entrance to the shed. There was Isabella, dressed in a medical coat, hair tied up, a radiant smile that lit up the whole room. They hadn't seen each other in person for months, just weekly phone conversations. "Isabella," he exclaimed emotionally, walking quickly to hug his daughter. "Hi, Dad," she said, kissing his cheek. "I came to see this phenomenon that is revolutionizing the national industry." "Phenomenon, Dad?" His story spread throughout the country. There are companies calling home asking about their consulting services. Antonio was surprised. How so? The story of the cleaning assistant who became the Sayor consultant became a legend in the industrial sector. Everyone wants to meet the man who proved that experience is worth more than a degree. Enrique approached to greet Isabella, clearly impressed. "Dr. Isabella, it is an honor to welcome you here. Your father revolutionized our company, I imagine. He has always been like that. When I was little, I saw important businessmen calling home, asking for help from Dad, with problems that no one could solve." "Tell us more about it," Gabriel asked curiously. Isabella looked at her father, who felt her discreetly. It was time to tell the full story. "My father is not only an experienced mechanic," she started with pride in her voice. "He is Antonio Silva da Silva Engenharia Automotiva, one of the biggest references in engine development in Brazil." The silence that fell on the group was absolute. Enrique stopped breathing. The young engineers looked at each other in shock. "Silva Engenharia," Enrique repeated slowly. "The company that developed the engines of the Ford line of the 90s, the same," Isabella confirmed. "And the Mercedes systems for tropical conditions and the Volkswagen modifications for fuel alcohol." Matthew was pale. "Sir, Master Anthony." "Are you Antonio Silva, the legendary Silva da Silva Engineering?" "Era," Antonio replied modestly. "Today I'm just an employee learning to be useful again." "Useful?" Enrique exploded. "Senor Antonio, you are a living legend of national engineering. Why didn't you tell me that before?" "Because I wanted to be judged by what I do today, not by what I did in the past." Rodrigo, who had become a frequent visitor to the factory to learn from Antonio, arrived at that moment and heard the revelation. "Antonio Silva da Silva, Engineering. Sir, I studied your projects in college. You are an icon." The news spread through the factory like lightning. Officials began to flock, wanting to learn more about the full story of the man they had so underestimated. "Dad," Isabella said emotionally, "tell him about the projects that changed the Brazilian industry." Antonio took a deep breath. He was finally ready to share his full story. "I developed my first revolutionary engine when I was your age." He started by looking at the young engineers. It was a system that increased efficiency by 20% and reduced emissions by 30%. "And then?" Leonardo asked fascinatedly. "Then came the international contracts. Mercedes hired me to adapt European engines for tropical climate. Ford wanted more economical systems. Volkswagen needed expertise in fuel alcohol. How many patents did you register? Gabriel asked, impressed. 47 patents registered. Some are still used today. Sebastian shouted from the crowd, and we thought he was just a retired old man. Laughter and clapping echoed through the shed. Antonio smiled, seeing how his story inspired and moved people of all ages. But the best part of the story, Isabella continued, is that my father abandoned all of this at the height of his career to take care of my mother and when she got sick. What do you mean you abandoned? Henry asked. He turned down millionaire contracts, canceled important projects, sold the company, all to stay close to home and take care of his family. The revelation deeply moved all those present. Joaquim wiped a tear that flowed without permission. After Mom left, Isabella continued with a choked voice. Dad was lost, worked simple jobs, never complained, never bragged about what he had been until he decided to go back to what he always loved and ended up here. Bruno completed emotionally, disguised as a cleaning assistant. He was not disguised, Antonio corrected him. I was starting again, humbly from scratch, proving my worth through actions. And he succeeded, Mateus said with admiration. It taught us more in months than we learned in college years. He taught us humility. Gabriel added, it taught us that real knowledge comes from practice. Leonardo completed. Henrique approached emotionally. Senor Antonio, can I make a proposal? Clear. I want you to set up a center of excellence here in the company, a place where young engineers from all over the country can come and learn from you. Let's call it the Antonio Silva Institute. Mr. Director, it is not a discussion, it is a national need. What you know cannot die with you. It needs to be transmitted to new generations. Rodrigo joined enthusiastically. Senor Antonio, can I be the first associate consultant of the Institute? I want to learn everything I don't know yet. We all want it, said Matthew, Gabriel, and Leonardo in leather. Isabella hugged her father with tears in her eyes. Dad, you did it. He returned to the top without losing his humility. I didn't go back to the top, daughter. I found my place. What place is this? Anthony looked around, saw young faces thirsty for knowledge. He saw respectful veterans. He saw a company transformed by the power of respected experience. My place is teaching, transmitting knowledge, proving that age is not a limitation, it is an accumulation of wisdom. The factory exploded in applause once again. Henrique officially announced the creation of the Institute. Rodrigo committed to bringing fellow consultants to learn. The young engineers offered to document all of the master's teachings. Months later, the story of Antonio Silva had become a national legend. Companies sent young engineers to intern with him. Universities invited him to lectures. Her story inspired people of all ages to never give up on their dreams. But for Antonio, the greatest success was not the invitations or recognitions. It was to see Mateus, Gabriel, and Leonardo become exceptional engineers. It was receiving letters from employees thanking them for their life lessons. It was knowing that I had proven something fundamental. It's never too late to start over, Dad. Isabella said in one of hers you visit. What is the biggest lesson that this experience taught you? Antonio thought for a few seconds, watching the movement of the factory around, that the true value of a person is not in what he appears to have, but in what he can really offer. And that knowledge without humility is arrogance, but humility without knowledge is waste. But what about judging people by their appearance? I learned that everyone deserves a second chance to show who they really are, including myself. The conversation was interrupted by a group of young engineers from another company who had arrived for a week of intensive training. Antonio smiled, seeing how his story had multiplied. Master Anthony. One of them approached respectfully. We came here to learn about engines, but our bosses said we're going to learn a lot more about life. They really will. Antonio replied with the serene smile of someone who found his purpose. Because engines and people have a lot in common. Both work best when treated with respect and understanding. And as he began another class for a new class of young engineers, Antonio knew that he had fulfilled something greater than any millionaire contract. I had proven that age is wisdom, experience is treasure, and it is never too late to show the world what you are capable of. The story of the cleaning assistant who became a master had become an eternal lesson. Never judge a book by its cover, because you may be missing the opportunity to know a masterpiece.